Aggressiveness in children is not something that appears out of nowhere like lightning in a clear sky. It's something that accumulates slowly over years of repressed emotions, ignored needs, and anger that never found a place to be seen or understood. Aggressiveness is often the last language left when all the others have been silenced. Here lies the uncomfortable truth. Behind most aggressive teenagers are parents who love their children deeply but have unintentionally created an environment where anger has become the only form of communication still available, not because they are bad parents, but because they are repeating patterns they never examined, because they are responding to their own anxiety instead of the child's real needs. And beneath the surface of every slammed door, every shout, every hostile reply, is a teenager desperately trying to say something that no one seems willing to hear. First mistake, denying emotions. There is something particularly damaging that happens when a teenager expresses anger or frustration, and the parent responds with, "You have no reason to be angry," or "You're exaggerating." In that moment, the parent believes they are calming the situation, bringing back rationality, but what they are actually doing is something far more dangerous. They are teaching that anger is not acceptable, that certain emotions must be hidden, denied, buried. And when an emotion is constantly denied, it does not disappear. It accumulates, it grows in the shadows. And when it finally emerges, it does so with a force that often surprises everyone, including the teenager. Neuroscience tells us something fundamental. Emotions need to be recognized in order to be processed. When an emotion is seen, named, validated, the nervous system naturally begins to regulate itself. But when it is denied, the nervous system stays activated, searching for increasingly intense ways to be noticed. Teenagers who grow up hearing that their emotions are not valid learn to express them in increasingly extreme ways. Not because they want to be difficult, but because it's the only way they can finally be taken seriously. Aggressiveness becomes proof that yes, something really is wrong. It becomes the language of those who have no other words left. Second mistake, modeling aggressive behavior as parents. Then there is perhaps the hardest truth to face. Teenagers learn aggressiveness by watching their parents, not from the words we say about how to handle anger, but from how we handle it ourselves. Children and teenagers are professional observers. They record every outburst, every slammed door, every insult thrown in a moment of frustration. When a parent yells, the teenager learns that yelling is how adults deal with discomfort. When a parent becomes physically intimidating, the teenager learns that physical power is an acceptable way to resolve conflict. When a parent uses cruel sarcasm or humiliation, the teenager learns that hurting with words is a legitimate tactic. Research on social modeling is unequivocal. Children exposed to parental aggressiveness have significantly higher chances of becoming aggressive themselves, not because they are genetically predisposed, but because they are simply replicating what they have seen modeled as normal. And here is the cruel paradox. Many parents who yell at their children to stop yelling do not see the irony. They are trying to extinguish a behavior by using that same behavior as the method. And the teenager learns not the lesson the parent intended, but the one the parent is living. The alternative requires something harder than yelling. Stopping, breathing, saying, "I'm very frustrated right now. I need a moment before I can talk about this calmly." That is the lesson that builds emotional competence, not aggressiveness. Third mistake, lack of autonomy. There is a direct relationship between excessive control and teenage aggressiveness. Teenagers have an evolutionary need for autonomy. It is how the brain is designed to develop during this stage. When that need is constantly frustrated, when every decision is made by the parent, when there is no space for personal choice, it creates an internal pressure desperately seeking an outlet. Aggressiveness often becomes that outlet. It becomes the only way the teenager can assert a sense of self separate from the parent. "You can't control me" becomes the message behind every act of rebellion, every explosion of anger. Studies show that teenagers with overly controlling parents report higher levels of anger and oppositional behavior. not because they are naturally difficult, but because they are fighting for something fundamental, the right to exist as separate individuals. When a parent constantly dictates what to wear, what to eat, who to spend time with, what hobbies to pursue, they are essentially saying, "I don't trust you to be yourself." And that lack of trust creates deep anger. Because autonomy is not a luxury for teenagers, it is an essential developmental need. The alternative is offering age-appropriate choices, setting clear boundaries for what is non-negotiable while allowing room for autonomous decisions in other areas. This balance allows teenagers to exercise autonomy in constructive rather than destructive ways. Fourth mistake, inconsistent consequences. It is deeply destabilizing for a teenager when rules change based on the parent's mood, when something acceptable yesterday becomes punishable today, when consequences depend more on the parent's emotional state than on the teenager's actions. This inconsistency creates chronic anxiety. The teenager never knows what to expect. They cannot learn to navigate the rules because the rules are constantly shifting, and that unpredictability is terrifying. It creates a sense of powerlessness that often manifests as aggressiveness. When you cannot predict or control anything in your environment, aggressiveness becomes a way to at least create the illusion of power. It becomes a way to say, "I can still have an impact, even if it's negative." Research on discipline shows that consistency matters more than severity. Teenagers can handle even strict rules if they are predictable and consistently applied. But when consequences are chaotic, when they depend on the mood of the moment, they create deep dysregulation. The alternative requires parents to do the difficult work of separating themselves emotionally from their reactions, to set clear consequences when they are calm and then apply them consistently, regardless of how they feel in the moment. That predictability creates safety, and safety reduces aggressiveness. Fifth mistake, lack of recognition. Many parents fall into the trap of noticing only what goes wrong. The teenager cleans their room. Silence. The teenager forgets to take out the trash. Storm of criticism. This asymmetry in recognition creates something toxic. The teenager learns that the only way to get attention is through negative behavior. That being good means being invisible. And if the choice is between being invisible and being seen through conflict, many teenagers unconsciously choose conflict. Neuroscience of attention shows that the brain is wired to seek recognition. It is a fundamental need as real as food or shelter. When positive recognition is scarce or absent, the brain begins seeking any kind of attention, even negative. This explains why many aggressive behaviors persist even in the face of harsh punishment. Because punishment is still attention, it is still recognition, and for a teenager who feels invisible, even a parent's anger is better than indifference. The alternative is making the deliberate effort to notice what goes well, to name positive behaviors as they happen. "I noticed you helped your brother with his homework," or "I appreciate that you cleaned the kitchen without being asked." This kind of recognition fills the need to be seen, reducing the need for extreme behaviors to get attention. Sixth mistake, humiliation as discipline. There is a thin but crucial line between correction and humiliation. Correction says you did something wrong. Humiliation says there is something wrong with you. And when that line is crossed, when a parent uses cruel sarcasm, public shaming, or ridicule as discipline, it plants deep anger. Humiliation triggers something primitive in the human brain. It activates the social threat system, the part of us wired to respond to group rejection as a survival threat. And when that threat comes from the person who is supposed to be your primary source of safety, it creates devastating confusion. Studies show that teenagers who regularly experience humiliation from their parents have significantly higher rates of aggressive behavior, because humiliation creates shame, and shame, when it cannot be processed, often turns into anger. It is easier to feel angry than to feel the shame beneath it. When a parent says things like, "You're pathetic," or "You'll never amount to anything," or exposes the teenager's failures in front of others, they create wounds that can last for decades. And the teenager, lacking the emotional vocabulary to process that shame, often expresses it through aggressiveness. The alternative is disciplining with respect, correcting behavior without attacking identity, speaking privately rather than publicly, keeping the teenager's dignity intact even while setting consequences for inappropriate actions. Seventh mistake, invalidating their needs. Finally, there is perhaps the most pervasive mistake, treating the teenager's needs as less important, less real, less urgent than the parents'. "I'm too tired to talk right now" becomes the standard reply when the teenager needs connection. "It's not important" is said when the teenager expresses a concern that feels enormous to them. This constant invalidation creates frustration that builds. The teenager begins to feel that their needs don't matter, that their voice carries no weight, and when needs are constantly ignored, when reasonable requests for attention, for listening, for presence are dismissed, aggressiveness often becomes the escalation necessary to finally be taken seriously. Research on teenage attachment shows that young people still need connection with their parents, even when they don't show it. When that connection is consistently denied, when their attempts to reach out are rejected, it creates a pattern of protest that can manifest as anger. The teenager is essentially saying, "See me, hear me, I'm here." But when normal channels of communication have been closed, when asking nicely leads nowhere, aggressiveness becomes the megaphone they use to be heard. All these mistakes share a common root: emotional disconnection. When a teenager does not feel seen, heard, respected in their full humanity, when their emotions are denied and their needs invalidated, aggressiveness often becomes the only language left. But the good news is that connection can be rebuilt. It does not require perfection. It requires presence. It requires the willingness to see anger not as a problem to eliminate, but as a message to decode. What is my child trying to say through this aggressiveness? What need is unmet? What emotion hasn't found a healthy way to be expressed? When we begin to ask these questions, when we begin to treat aggressiveness as communication rather than a character flaw, everything changes. We can begin creating a space where difficult emotions can be felt without becoming destructive, where needs can be expressed without escalation, where the teenager can be fully themselves without having to shout to be heard. And maybe in the end, reducing teenage aggressiveness means this: creating a home where vulnerability is safe, where emotions have space, where needs are taken seriously, where a teenager can say, "I'm angry," and know that anger will be seen, understood, respected, rather than denied or punished. Because when anger finds a safe place to exist, it often transforms. It doesn't disappear, but it becomes something manageable, something that can be felt and moved through rather than exploded. And that is the difference between destructive aggressiveness and healthy emotions that flow and pass, leaving room for the authentic connection both parent and teenager desperately seek. Let me know in the comments if you've ever experienced one of these mistakes, and subscribe to the channel for more videos.